Hello and welcome back to The Anecdotalist, episode 19. I'm your host, Paul Packard, and with me as always, my co-host, Jason McKinney.
How's it going, everybody?
Tonight we are covering the mystery of the Dyatlov Pass incident, a famous story of 9 hikers who, while hiking in the Ural Mountains, met an unexplainable death. So, Jason, are you ready?
I am. But buddy, first you gotta ask me what I'm drinking for tonight.
Oh gosh, what are you drinking tonight?
So I got a gift. I got a gift of pumpkin spice moonshine from a friend of mine. And this stuff is delicious.
We have a lot of content to get through tonight. I hope you're not sloppy by the end of it. That's all I can ask.
We'll find out.
Oh, man. Okay, here we go. The wind is the only sound on the mountain. It's muffled by the snowfall. It's incredibly quiet. Up ahead, a tattered tent. Covered in snow and barely standing, the tent held the contents of the 9 hikers' belongings. But no hikers. The hikers were found scattered around the area. All 9 were dead.
So I gotta say, I like drinking pumpkin spice moonshine here. It kind of gives me that cold weather, like curl up next to a book vibe. And the starting of that cold opening made me feel really comfortable and like fall weather like. But then you had to mention dead bodies.
Yeah, that definitely puts a damper on the weather, the fall coming in. I mean, you're dealing with a hurricane over there in South Carolina right now, but I mean, it does put a damper on the coziness of my studio here.
Yeah, I'm really hoping that the weather doesn't knock out our recording session.
The last half of this might be me flying solo. We'll find out. All right, so tonight we're getting into a very famous unsolved mystery. And there's a lot of content out there on this one. And I've been trying to do my best up until this point to kind of steer away from more of the famous stories, just because I wanted to have more experience under my belt. And just now that we've gotten into the groove and we're about 19 episodes in, I felt like it's time to tackle one of my favorite stories, the Dyatlov Pass incident.
Yeah, I kind of got excited about this when you were telling me a little bit about the intro to this. I mean, I love the fact that it sounds almost like it's gonna involve multiple theories, and it sounded very complicated when you first started talking about it on how all this happened.
Yeah, it's an incredibly famous case, and our listeners, if they listen to a lot of podcasts or read up on stories on unsolved mysteries, they've probably heard the story before. There's a lot of theories out there, and it's really funny because I have some really solid, good sources that I use for this episode, and there's quite a few that we'll put in the show notes. And a couple of them have very definitive, here's what happened at the end, but they're different. There are a lot of theories that people hang their hats on for this, and there's some really good ones that we're going to get into later. But if you're listening to our show for the first time, typically how we do this is we'll talk about the timeline. We'll go through a little bit of the history first, the timeline of what happened, and then what we know. We'll follow up with the investigation, and then we'll talk theories, and then we'll wrap up with our own thoughts. So jumping into the history here, the original approval for such a hike by the Sverdlovsk City Committee of Physical Culture and Sport approved 11 hikers. The 11th listed man was a man by the name of Simeon Zolotarov. However, he did not accompany the group on this expedition. The process to approve hikes through Ural Polytechnic Institute University, or UPI, and beyond this point, we'll refer to this university as UPI, was to submit the hike with pre-planned routes through the hiking club. It would make its way to the UPI administration, by which they would review it, and they'd look at each hiker and make sure the route made sense and ensure that everyone and everything was compatible with a grade 3 hike. So there were 10 people, all experienced grade 2 hikers, the highest grade being grade 3, which they would all receive certification after the ski tour experience gained from this hike. These weren't just some random hikers that were inexperienced. These guys had spent a lot of their lives hiking, and they were grade 2, which is very close to being as highly skilled as possible. And of course, this last hike would have got them to the highest grade possible for a hiker.
I wonder what the requirements are for these grade 3 hikers. Like, what do you know? What, like, is it just like how many hikes you do or how many hikes you survive?
Yeah, so the grade 3 certification requires 186 miles of terrain to be covered, of which a third has to be in what is considered to be challenging terrain. The minimum length must be no less than 16 days, with 6 nights spent in a tent and 8 days in uninhabited regions. And I pulled a lot of this from different sources, of course. And one of the books I used was Dead Mountain: The Untold True Story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident by Donnie Eichar, and he gets into like the details on what these different grades are. But the certification they're seeking right now, the grade 3 certification, was what I just explained. And this trip was set to meet all those requirements.
Wow. I mean, this sounds pretty intense. I mean, would you have to? I'm guessing you would probably have to learn how to. Well, I guess they'd pack their own food in. I mean, do you think they have to learn how to hunt and everything as well?
No, no, no. So the hikes, they brought everything with them that they needed, and they were working up to this. So they've been working up to this grade 3 hike, and other hikes were shorter, less intense, but they get used to how much needs to be in their pack, how much the pack weighs, and then the group themselves. Each person has to carry their own weight essentially, because if one person falters or fails, they have to take all the contents of that pack and spread it across all the other people. And that actually ends up happening. We'll talk about that here in a second. But they plan for the entire 16 days. They have provisions for the whole thing. They have tent, equipment, all the things they're going to need for that entire trip. And then the only thing they're really doing is creating fires and building tent, putting their tent up every night, essentially.
Oh wow, that's pretty intense.
Yeah, very. So the group was formed by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student at UPI. So Dyatlov was a leader, having led several Category 2 hikes. Category 1 was easy, 2 medium, and 3 the most difficult. He was considered to be the best hiker in the UPI hiking club. He was also an inventor, so he modified radios for hikes. He had a tent stove that was intended for warmth, and he even had his own double tent. Basically, he just sewed 2 tents together. But he was pretty active in the hiking club as well as engineering new inventions for hiking, which was partly what he used for this hike.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like a good hike mate to have with you, or hiking partner. How would you say that?
Yeah, I don't know, fellow hiker.
Yeah, fellow teammate.
Yeah, basically a team lead. So Dyatlov, he recruits his team. And so I'm going to get through 9 Soviet names here. And I'm going to do my best to pronounce all of them correctly. I actually spent quite a bit of time pulling up all these people's names and running them through a pronunciation program. So I wrote out how to pronounce these guys' names. So I'm going to do my best, and I'm not going to try to offend anybody. I figured if I'm going to talk about this famous case, I should at least be able to pronounce everybody's names correctly. So that's what I'm going to do here. Here's all 9 hikers, or all 10 hikers, I guess. So there were 4 fourth-year UPI students: 22-year-old Z Naida Kalmegorov, 21-year-old Yuri Doroshenko, 24-year-old Alexander Kolevatov, 22-year-old Yuri Yudin. Third-year UPI student, 20-year-old Luda Dubaina. 3 UPI graduates, 23-year-old George Krivonishenko, 23-year-old Rostem Slobodin, 23-year-old Nicholas Tibu Brignoli. Lastly, there's 37-year-old Simon Zolotarov. So Simon actually was a World War II vet where he saw plenty of combat. And UPI was looking at Simon as like a potential hiking instructor. So they put Simon with the Dyatlov crew. And originally the group was not really happy about getting some random 37-year-old guy, because they're all like college students, and they get this older guy that shows up. And they're not happy at first about it, but they really quickly adopt him into the group, and they become really friendly with him. And as they're prepping for this hike, he becomes part of the group really fast. But initially they're like, why are we getting this old guy? And he was just added on to the team because they wanted him to have the experience before he became an instructor at the UPI.
You can't laugh at me for asking this, but this looks like all male hikers. Is that correct?
So there's actually 2 girls in the group. The rest are male, but yeah, there are 2 girls at least.
Okay, dang. I mean, this seems like a pretty well prepared group, though. Other than the fact that they're all in their 20s, I guess being 30 years old now, looking at a bunch of 20-year-olds, I'd be kind of skeptical of their ability to do something like this.
So yeah, you do look at these ages and you think, wow, these guys are pretty young, especially us. We've been out of high school and college for a while now, but at the time, you got to remember it is Soviet Russia in 1959. They've seen some stuff, and think about when the peak of your physical abilities in your early 20s. You're going to go on a hike like this. I mean, when we were in our early 20s, I feel like I was pretty in shape relative to what I am now. And these guys are essentially at the peak of their hiking career. They've been doing it for several years. A lot of them are either fourth year students, a couple of them are graduates. And so they've been hiking for a long time. And they all live in Siberia. So, I mean, they're used to this. This is not something that's like they haven't grown up doing, essentially.
And they're Russian.
Yeah. And they're a bunch of Soviets. Not that there's anything wrong with that. So the group was very comfortable with each other, and they had done plenty of hikes together. They were all super young and eager to get their grade 3 certification. And to make a quick note here, Dyatlov was approved to bring his tent stove and his double tent, but he was denied bringing his modified radios, as they were deemed like a comfort that a grade 3 hike shouldn't have. And so the question becomes like, man, if he had his radios, maybe they could have radioed out, or at least we would have some idea of what happened, but they had no way to communicate with the outside world once they started this hike. Also approved was a 217-mile hike over 16 days through the Ural Mountains in a circular route. The group was to start in the village of Vizay, so they take a train from Sverdlovsk to Serov, another train to Ividal. From there, it's a bus to Vizay. Then a truck ride to Sector 41, where the hike begins through an abandoned geological site to the Dyatlov Pass, and then back. And of course, at the time, it wasn't called Dyatlov Pass. It was named that after the Dyatlov group that died before they got to the pass, essentially. All right, so that's kind of like the background of what we're doing tonight. And so right here, we're going to start our timeline. It's now January 23rd, 1959, when the group takes their first train ride, going from Sverdlovsk to Serov. To make a quick note here, there's another hiking group led by a guy named Yuri Blinov. This group is with them all the way to Vizay. And I want to quote him really fast from the book Dead Mountain, The Untold Story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident by Donnie Eichar. Quote, "Together we went through all the transitions between trains, buses, and trucks in Serov, Ividal, and Vizay. In other words, on our way, we still communicated like members of the same hiking group." End quote. So later, Blinov joins the search team, and he's an active participant in the search for these guys. And it's kind of sad because what I was reading was they were also going, they're from UPI, and their trip, the Dyatlov team, it's like the mirror of them. So he has his own team. They ride with him on the train all the way up. They take trains, buses, trucks together, and then they split off to do their hike. Their group comes back. The Dyatlov group doesn't come back. And they're really perturbed by that. And he actually joins the search committee to help find them. And of course, they find bodies at the end of it.
I would like you to say every single name of Blinhoff's group.
Yeah, that's not happening. And I think it's Blinov. That's how you say that.
I'm sorry, Blinhoff. Anybody out there with the name Blinhoff? I apologize.
I mean, we do have listeners in Russia. I've seen the numbers come in from over there. So someone is bound to have one of these names.
Once again, I am sorry, Blinhoff.
So they arrive in Serov early morning on the 24th, waiting to depart at 6:30. So before they depart, George gets arrested, and he's playfully asking for candy from strangers like a beggar. And the Soviet police, they're like, "This is a good communist town. We don't do this." And so he gets arrested, but he gets released pretty quickly. And they end up at a school killing some time. And they do like an impromptu show for the kids. They basically do a Q&A with these kids from the school, and they're asking all these questions, and the kids are having fun. And they kill a bunch of time, and they get back to the train. So they're going to catch the train at 6:30, but they have another run-in with the police. This time, a drunk person was convinced that the group had stolen his vodka, and the drunk actually gets arrested himself. And the group, they get on their way and they head towards the mountain.
So what happened was the drunk finally got out of jail and hunted these guys down.
Doesn't sound right, but maybe it could be. Well, you know what? There's actually a theory that it was escaped prisoners that killed this group. So maybe it was this guy all along.
Called it. I called it.
He goes to jail and he's plotting and planning. He gets out, and he and his Yeti friends show up and tear the tent apart and kill these guys.
Oh, there's Yetis involved.
Potentially. Well, that is definitely a theory, and we're going to get into it later. So by all intents and purposes, they seem like an amazing group of people. Well-meaning, young college kids, excited, and they're just really excited to get going on this. And I want to point out, I'm talking about all this. I know you're like, let's just get to the hike. But just to add some color, because like we've all been this age. Some of our listeners, if you're younger than this, you haven't been this age yet. But like when you don't have the responsibilities of like a family, a job, you're in college, and you get to like pal around with your friends and then go on like an adventure. That's what's happening with these guys. They're in their prime. They're excited. They're young, and just try to relate to them in a way, because imagine yourself in their shoes, right? If you're young, you're getting ready to go on this exciting hike, and what are you going to do? We've killed time, you and I, Jason. I mean, they had to kill 12 hours, and they just had fun doing it. There's a lot of like excitement for this trip. So the group gets to Ividal on the 25th, where they jump on a bus headed for Vizay, where they stay until the next day, the 26th, where they eat and say goodbye to the Blinoff group. So they're with the Blinoff group up until this point. They jump in the back of a woodcutter's truck. So Vizay was a woodcutting community, and they take that truck to Sector 41. So they land at Sector 41, and that's a small settlement of woodcutters. It's kind of like on the outskirts. It's getting pretty close to this uninhabited area of Siberia. So they take them in, and from everything I read, they were like super excited to have visitors, and they fed them and they helped the group. And it's funny because you asked this earlier about if there was any girls in this group or if it was all men. So one of the things I read was some of these guys from this woodcutting community hadn't seen girls in like several months. So there was like a lot of excitement to bring these guys in because they had like young college age girls in the group, and they were excited to see some women. I mean, they had been out in this woodcutting community for several months, living in cabins and stuff. And so they have these young guys come in, these young college kids come in, and they're super excited. They feed them, they have some fun. And then from there, another guy shows up on this horse-drawn sleigh. They call him Grandpa Slava. And so he was actually set to make a run from Sector 41 to an abandoned settlement about 15 miles away. But it's in the direction that the hikers are going. So he allows them to put all their packs in the sleigh, and they hike that 15-mile trek to all these cabins, to this settlement, without having their packs on them. And so it just kind of lightens the load, and they get to this village, which is about 20 cabins, and they're all abandoned. It's like this old settlement that's been abandoned. And Grandpa Slava, he's going there to collect some like pipes and stuff, like metal pipes. For whatever reason, he's doing like a scavenge, I guess. And so they all stay one night in one of these cabins, including Grandpa Slava. And so the next day, so Yuri Yudin, he, up until this point, has provided all this firsthand information. He actually realizes he's got a problem. And he's having this like really bad leg pain. He's got a bad leg, and he realizes that he can't do this grade 3 hike. There's no way. And he has to turn back. So he, along with Grandpa Slava, they load up the sleigh, and they head back towards Vizay, expecting to see them back in like 10 days or so. And so remember earlier I talked about how they had all their packs. So there was 10 people, all their packs had things in it. They had to then get all their packs out and spread out Yuri Yudin's stuff, because they had to carry what he was bringing, essentially. Not all of it, but some of it. Everything we know about the group from here on out is basically from photos and diary entries. But everything up until this point is all firsthand information from Yuri Yudin.
Man, so this trip is like starting out pretty rocky, having to already take from one of your hiking mates to spread it against 10.
Yeah, that's the thing about it, is that like I don't think the weight is that big of a deal. I don't think it was that much stuff, but you're right, it did start off bad. I mean, one of your people already can't make the journey. And I think it just goes to show you like how serious they took this. I mean, Yuri Yudin, he wanted to go on this trip. He wanted to get his grade 3 certification. But he realized this pain he's having in his leg, this back pain, he wasn't going to survive this trip if he went with them. He was just going to slow him down. I think it just adds a little bit of how serious this trip actually is. And think about like when people climb Mount Everest and how every little ounce of weight matters. And I think you're right. Yeah, maybe it didn't seem like a lot, but like every little ounce matters because you're carrying weight, you're slugging through snow, you're on skis. It's not easy terrain to cover. And so it didn't start off great. They're having fun, they're excited, but one of the members has to turn back. So from January 28th to February 1st, the group treks deeper into the Ural Mountains. And so they have some photos and diary entries. And in these photos and diary entries, there's a lot of Mansi symbolism found carved into trees. So the Mansi, they're an indigenous group, and there's a lot of them living in this area and hunting at this time. So they live in northwestern Siberia between the Ural Mountains and the Ob River. They're mostly peaceful people. And when interviewed, they claim that the area the hikers were in is not considered like sacred or anything and not religious spots. And that although they saw ski tracks, they neither heard nor saw the group. And so the Mansi people, they become suspects really quickly in all this because they're very active in this area. And so the Mansi signs are everywhere. And they're basically just things carved in trees, like dashes to symbolize how many people are in the group of Mansi hunters, some symbolism, and then how many dogs they have with them. But they're basically hunters and indigenous people in this area. What's nice about this is that since they're hunting in this area, the group can actually follow some of their trails for a little bit. So I want to quote Xena from the book Dead Mountain, The Untold True Story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident by Donnie Eichar. Quote, maybe the title of our trip should be In the Land of Mysterious Signs. If we knew their meaning, we could follow the path without worrying that it might take us in the wrong direction. End quote. So they were seeing these Mansi symbolisms everywhere. And she was basically making the point of, hey, if we knew what this meant, we probably could take these trails all the way up to the pass and all the way back because the Mansi people are all throughout this area. She also says, quote, Mansi, Mansi, Mansi. This word becomes more frequent in our talks. Mansi are people of the north. It's a very interesting and peculiar nation living in northern Urals, close to Tumain region, end quote. So basically, the Mansi are everywhere, and this group is like, they're seeing all these symbols, and they're like, man, there's a lot of this out here. And they're talking about the Mansi people as they're going through and trekking through this hike. So one of the other things that comes up in the diary is that the stove. So remember we talked about how Dyatlov had invented the stove tent or the tent stove and the dual tent as well as the radios. So he has this stove and they talk about how like at night the stove gets really hot and no one really wants to sleep right next to it because it gets so hot that they have to strip their clothing. And actually the night before their deaths, Slobodin's jacket catches fire and burns. So they have this like really hot stove in the tent with them while they're sleeping at night. So keep that in mind when we talk about maybe what happens later. But that comes up in the diary that this stove is incredibly hot and no one really wants to sleep next to it.
But you're in these mountains. Isn't it pretty cold up there?
Yeah, it's incredibly cold. So having a stove is great. I kind of wonder if like there was a way to have it in there that wouldn't keep it as hot. And the other thing too is they're also bundled up. So like having to strip down and get really hot at night is kind of like counterintuitive a little bit because usually they just sleep in their stuff. And having to sleep next to the stove, I think they get really toasty. Another thing I want to note quickly is when the group is setting up for camp, in one instance, at least they were about 200 yards out in the open, and they actually end up doubling back to set up camp by some trees. So keep that in mind here in a second when we talk about the actual incident. They're very cognizant of where to put the tent and how to set the tent up. In this case specifically, they were 200 yards out in the open. And they're like, okay, we got to get closer to some trees. When they're out in the open, there's a lot of high winds that blow through and can cause some problems. And so prior to the incident, they actually end up doubling back 200 yards, hike backwards 200 yards to get back to some trees so they can set up camp. And so there seems to be some kind of argument, I guess, the day before their deaths between Lyuda and Nikolai about who would repair the tent, sewing the holes and such. So at night, I guess, and when they set this tent up and they tear it down over and over, they're constantly repairing this tent. I imagine just like it gets damaged over time. And so they're trying to make sure that every night it's secure. And so the argument gets bad enough that Layuda, I mean, she skips dinner and hides away in the tent. So they're all outside eating, and she decides, okay, I'm done. I'm going to go inside the tent and just cool off. So there is something that, like, even though they're friends, there was an argument the night before. So the next morning, it's January 31st. And so Dyatlov writes about the wind really picking up, and he notes that the weather was an illusion. Like, basically, it feels like it's snowing, but there's clear skies, and that the trees are, all this snowfall on the trees is coming off and like blowing on them. This is where it really starts to pick up that it's getting really windy, and maybe the weather is not, they're not in a great spot weather-wise. But this is when the diaries start really talking about the weather and like the wind picking up. And so the snow is like super deep at this point. And they start to do this thing called path treading. So it's a term that they came up with, where basically the leader, he takes off his pack and he beats the snow, like cutting a path with his pack. He beats the snow over and over. Does that for about 5 minutes, and then he will sit down and rest, and the next person in line becomes the leader, and they keep doing this over and over as they like beat their way through the snow. And they note that it takes forever to do this, and they're only traveling about 1.5 to 2 kilometers an hour, just beating the snow in this process.
Man, this sounds like a lot of work just to hike. I mean, they have to hike 217 miles and they're already having to do stuff like this.
Yeah, that's the thing that's crazy. Well, I mean, it just goes to show you, this isn't some like, oh, we will hike through the woods. This is like a friendly, this is a really intense hike, and they're pushing themselves to the limit to get this grade 3 certification. And they're in like waist deep snow. And what's interesting is, if you're familiar with how areas like this get snow, it'll snow and snow and snow, and it'll pack in and get really tough. The stuff on top that they're walking through is powdery, so they have to like beat it down, but they're walking on really deep snow. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, because when they actually do the search, when the search committee comes out and they start trying to find them, they have to dig them out. They have to go deep into the snow to find the bodies and stuff. The snow, they're standing on like packed in snow, and then on top of that, there's new snow that's causing like, it's like powdery snow they have to wade through, essentially. So around 4 p.m., they start looking for a place to set up camp. And they're like not in a really super ideal location. And so they're in the valley, but they get set up and they turn in. They would log into their diary so basically the way the diaries worked was every morning they would write about the previous day. So they set up camp, and the very next day, it's February 1st, it's early in the morning, and they write a bunch of stuff down about what happened on the 31st. And that's how we know about how they were beating the snow with their bags, and the weather and the conditions and the illusion of it snowing and stuff. February 1st is the day that they die, essentially, the night of February 1st. And so the final entry comes from Dyatlov himself. And it's, quote, "It's hard to imagine such a cozy place anywhere at the ridge, under the piercing howls of the wind and hundreds of kilometers from any settlement," end quote. So that's the final words written that we have from this group. And so they're on this ridge. It's crazy windy, and they're basically at the peak of the danger that they're in. They're trying to gain this ground. So what we know of their final day actually comes from 10 photographs. And so mostly it's like innocuous in nature. The group had to essentially take photos and document everything to prove to the UPI committee that they had successfully did this grade 3 hike. So there's tons of photos of this event. If you go online and look up Dyatlov Pass, there's tons and tons of photos. And a lot of like the theories come from some of these photos. And so the final day, there's 10 photographs. And some of them like are the group hiking. One's of Slobodin wearing a burned jacket. Remember we talked about how his jacket caught on fire that one night? He's like wearing it, and it's kind of funny because it's all charred. Some of the photos like are them laughing together, just kind of messing around. And the final picture is actually this weird light smudge. And the light is like smudged across the picture, as well as this orb. And it's a really weird photo. And we're going to get back to this when we talk about theories later. But like the final photo is like a black photo with a light smudge across it and an orb in the middle. So think about that. So on February 1st, they build like a temporary shelter to put their supplies in. Because this part of the trip, what's happening is they have stayed the night. They're building this temporary shelter. They're going to put some of their stuff in the shelter, and they're going to ascend the mountain. And what they're going to do is pack their non-essentials into this shelter and then also collect a bunch of firewood so that when they return from the hike from the mountain, they have shelter immediately. They have firewood to work with and they have their food and stuff. They're only going to bring with them the bare minimum essentials at this point. So they build this shelter, do all this work. They're at the base of this mountain, and they set up camp on the east-facing slope at the base of the Otorton with the intention of ascending the next morning. And so they're in their tents by 9 p.m. And that's all we know. They never make it to the mountain. So it's now February 13th, and the Dyatlov group, they're not back. So a few days go by, and the families are like, okay, something's wrong. They start reaching out to UPI. And they basically just say, the group's delayed. Hey, this happens sometimes. The hikes, the routes aren't perfect. It's just been a few days. Let's wait. So then 4 days go by, and the club director, Lev Gordo, he shows up. And UPI decides, okay, we need to reach out. This is no longer what's expected. 4 days is way too long to be past your return date. So they send a telegram to Vizay, and what they get back is the Dyatlov group did not return. So they then form an official search party, and this is when Blinov shows up. So he was the leader of that other group that was with them, and so he's like, okay, they should be back. Something's weird, and he wants to join the group. So he jumps in. And so what's weird is that the official like route that they submit to UPI, the hiking commission, it's not on file. It's missing. So this delays them even further because they're going to go on like the 17th and look for this route, because if they don't have the route, they don't know where to search. And so it takes them like 3 days before they actually end up beginning the search, because this route is missing for some reason, which who knows why. So the search begins on February 20th, and they take a helicopter and they land near a Mansi village, where they speak with the indigenous people before boarding the helicopter, and they head toward the Urals. And this we talked about earlier, how we talked about the investigation with the Mansi people and how they said they hadn't seen this group. They saw the tracks, but never actually saw the people. This is where that information comes from. It comes from this first helicopter trip into this area where they sat down next to this village and talked to the Mansi people there. So a sports committee out of Sverdlovsk reaches out to a man by the name of Yevgeny Maslenikov. He consulted Dyatlov on the route and basically tells the committee, I told them it'd be hard, and the guy with the bum leg, he probably slowed them down. And so then he also joins the search. At this point, it's kind of funny because like they are like 7 days past when they're supposed to be back, and no one realizes that Yuri Yudin came back. They don't even realize that he's out there. So they spent like 3 days trying to figure out the route. And so they reach out to this guy, and he's telling them about like the route that they were talking about and all this stuff, not realizing that Yuri Yudin already turned back and he's in town. He's around. Maslenikov, he's like basically telling them that, yeah, the guy with the bum leg, he probably held them back. No wonder it's taking them so long to get back. I told them that was going to be a problem. But, Yuri Yudin with the bum leg, he turned back before the group started.
Did Yuri actually end up going back and trying to help them out? Like, I know he was already out of the hike before it really even began. So it's not like he really held them back any.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I didn't read much about Yuri Yudin other than what he talked about leading up to everything. I imagine he helped with the search party, the search committee. And the thing is that the committee was big. It was like 30 people on the ground. And the names of the people that we really talk about are the names of people that actually end up finding bodies, because like it took them forever to find these bodies. And so like it's not really recorded what Yuri Yudin was doing at this point, if he was helping them or what. But yeah, he turned back and he tells them like what happened up until that point, like all their information up until the point where he turns back with Grandpa Slava. All that information that we have comes from him. Yeah, I don't know. It was kind of weird because it was like, where was Yuri during all of this? Why was he not like talking to UPI and saying, hey, these guys didn't come back, which is kind of odd to me. Maybe he was, because I know the families were trying to reach out, so maybe he was part of that. But you would assume that they would know that he was back and they wouldn't have to go find Maslenikov. You'd think they'd just ask Yuri. So I don't know what he was doing at this point, actually.
Maybe Yuri just decided to hang out with Grandpa Slava.
Yeah. So by the 24th, there's something like 30 people on the ground. They're all sweeping the area. And there's helicopters in the air. There's all this going on. And so in the afternoon on the 25th, UPI hiking club members Boris Slopstov and Mikhail Sherhaven spot a black spot in the snow 70 meters away. And so they rush over to it and they realize it's a partially collapsed tent. And they call out, they don't hear anything. Near the tent is a flashlight and an axe, and they're laying nearby. And so Sherhaven, he grabs the axe and he swings it across the tent, ripping it open. And there's nobody inside. So everything inside the tent is carefully arranged, including food ready to eat, a bunch of other stuff. The tent's pretty badly mangled. There's like tears in it, some cuts in it. And about 20 yards away, they spot 9 sets of footprints. Some of the footprints have boots, and others they can tell these people were running in bare feet. So these footprints stretch for half a mile.
Okay, so I gotta ask, why in the world would he just rip the tent open with an axe? I mean, why not just open the tent instead of damaging it?
I imagine it was tied shut or something. I'm not really sure, but he has to use the axe to tear it open. And they're trying to rush and be quick because they know it's been like so many days past when they were supposed to return. And I imagine it was just easier to use the axe to cut it open.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it sounds like something traumatic really is happening here, though. If somebody's running off barefoot in the snow, something obviously happened.
Yeah, the majority of the hikers were not wearing shoes that night when they ran off into the wilderness, into the snow, into the storm. And so the footprints, they don't all lead in the same direction. And so after a little bit, they come to the base of a tree and they notice a partially covered, like haphazard fire pit, which basically tells them it's not a campsite and it's not a Monsey fire pit. And so nearby, they find the first of the hikers. So there's 2 bodies, no jackets, no pants. One body is wearing like underwear, lounge underwear, like long johns. One pant leg torn away, and their clothes are ripped and tattered. The other thing to note here is that they're under this like cedar tree, and there's all these branches, broken branches laying around them. One of the bodies is laying on some of the broken branches, and the branches are broken pretty high up. Like one of them like climbed up and fell or something really weird. Their bodies are like charred too, like their arms, some of their arms are charred. Like their arms fell into the fire and they burned. And there's also some like unused wood. Some of the wood was sitting nearby that they didn't use to keep the fire going. Like the fire was going and they were all there. These 2 guys were huddled near it. Their arms are charred, like they had their arms in it. And some of the wood was unburned. So one of them has bare feet and the other just a pair of socks. And their bodies are like pretty badly shredded. So the 2 hikers, it's Yuri Doroshenko and George Krivonishenko.
So is there another Yuri in this group? I thought Yuri was the one with the bum leg.
Yeah, there's like 3 Yuris. One of them is Yuri Yudin. This one is Yuri Doroshenko. I think there's a third one that goes by like a different name. But I mean, Yuri's a very common Soviet Russia name at this time, I think.
Interesting. So these guys are found away from their campsite next to a fire that was probably a fire. One of them looks like they climbed a tree, but overall, they apparently had to run away from their campsite so quick they couldn't put on a jacket and pants.
Yeah, they're missing clothing and they don't have shoes on, which you would assume indicates that, especially with the footprints, they left their tent in a hurry, essentially. And then once they got to this tree, they realized, hey, we're out in the middle of nowhere. It's freezing cold. There's probably, I think at this time, the weather was like a blizzard. There's snow and they couldn't make it back to their tent. So they make it down to the base of the cedar tree and they create this fire. And so we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the going theory is that one of them climbed the trees to break off branches closer to the top where branches were more dry. So they had to climb the tree to get dry branches. Maybe he fell, or maybe they got to the base and had all these branches in order to like make some kind of impromptu shelter. But they couldn't keep the fire going, or their hands were too numb and they were putting them in the fire to get them warm. One thing that can happen too, I read, there's a couple things here, that if you heat your body too quickly after you basically have hypothermia, it can have the opposite effect and cause more damage and cause you to go into like like not psychosis, but like maybe pass out. So one of the theories is that they were trying to warm up, and the heat from being so cold caused them both to like pass out, and kept them from keeping the fire stoked. And their arm like laid in the fire, and they burned, and they eventually just died of hypothermia. But yeah, the weird thing is that they're missing clothing on top of all this. Also, though, I will say, so I was writing this down, and I was like going through the notes, and I was doing all this stuff, and just by happenstance, I saw this video yesterday. I stumbled upon it, and it was a guy on Mount Everest, I think, that was dying essentially. They were hiking, and he was sitting down, and he had taken his gloves off, and his hands were like had ice on them, and he was like shaking. I never saw that video before. I don't even know how it came up, but essentially, what can happen is when you get at the tail end of hypothermia, you start going into like a psychosis, and you start kind of panicking and ripping your clothing off. I guess can happen. Kind of the same thing with like divers. If they're like cave divers and they're way down in the water, and you start to like get hypoxia and you start running out of oxygen, you panic and you rip your gear off, and you drown at that point. Kind of the same thing happens with hypothermia. Towards the end of it, you kind of get manic, or like you go into psychosis, and you start stripping down. That might be true here, but the clothes are missing. They don't have the clothes with them. There's no clothes on them, and they're gone. And so they had the presence of mind to make a fire, but it's not like they stripped their clothes because they were in psychosis, I don't think.
I mean, it also makes it look like they weren't quite psychotic yet, up until the point where they were getting branches from the tops of these trees to create a fire. Like, they had the right of mind to know that the drier branches were at the top of the trees up until that point.
Yeah. So a few hundred yards away in the valley, about a mile from the tent, and just a couple hours after the first men are found, a Monzi man named Stepan Kurakov and a grade 2 hiker, Vladislav Karelin, along with a police dog, a mix between like a German Shepherd and a Russian breed, they come across this body. And the body is completely buried in the snow. The dog is how they found them, because I guess somebody else had gone through this area before, but this dog smells the body and starts like pointing or whatever it does. They dig out Eichar Dyatlov, and he's clinging to a birch tree. And so his watch is stopped at 5:31. So they find his body a couple hours after they find Doroshenko and Krivonishenko. So they only have 3 bodies at this point. And the police dogs are searching. There's like 30 people on the ground, helicopters in the air, and they find another body. And that's Zina Kolmegrov. I talked about her as Zinaida earlier, but they call her Zina for short. And so her face is bloodied, and her leg is bent, as if she's like trying to climb or something. And she's the first to be dressed in what appears to be hiking clothes. So she's actually dressed properly, but she's also shoeless. Like, she has all her clothes on but her shoes. So they now have 4 bodies, and they begin speculating that they were swept away somehow from the tent after it was torn down, either by wind or by like an avalanche. But there's also some confusion as to why the tent was so intact. Like, if there were such high winds that they all got swept away, why were the poles still upright on this tent so many days after all this happened? And the tent was in such neat fashion, except for the snow that was kind of on top of it and the tears that were in it. And so I want to read quickly the official report by Maslinikov. Quote, "The tent was set up on the slope at a height of 1,079 meters. An even spot was made under the tent with skis laid at the bottom. The tent was covered with snow. The entrance was partly open, with sheet curtains sticking out. Urine traces were found where someone had been taking a leak. When the tent was dug out, a tear in the tent on the slope-facing side close to the entrance was found, with a fur jacket sticking out of the hole. The descent-facing side was torn to pieces. A pair of bound skis was lying in front of the tent entrance." End quote. So at this point, people are starting to accuse the Monzi people of playing some sort of role in what happened here. They're thinking, okay, these guys got killed by these people and it's being covered up. But they're all baseless accusations. There's no evidence to suggest that. And so several days go by, and a storm causes the group to turn back. So then finally on March 5th, another body is found. This one with one shoe and a ski hat. And so at this point, they're like, okay, if this guy has this like knit ski hat on, if he was blown away, wouldn't his hat have come off as well? And this body actually belongs to Slobodin. So everyone's starting to question, like, we thought an avalanche, we thought wind, we thought the Monzi people, but nothing is adding up. How is it the Monzi people when there's no other footprints? There's only 9 footprints. How is it the wind when this guy's wearing a knit hat and his hat's still on? And the avalanche thing, there's some snow on the tent, but like that would have been a bigger deal. And so they're confused as to what's going on, and they're like investigating. They're trying to find every angle at this point. So at this point, there's 5 bodies that have been found. And the prevailing theory is that one person left the tent with a flashlight to go pee, and somehow he either got blown away and he called out to the group and they all came out trying to find him, or he called out to the group because there was some kind of imminent danger and they all came running out because of that. And so somehow they either got blown far away and they couldn't get back to their tent, so they make this impromptu fire pit next to that cedar tree, and the other guys just end up trying to get back or whatever and get lost in the blizzard.
So I'm probably beating you to the punchline here, but would it be possible that maybe there was a bear or something that scared them out and they just thought maybe we can't go back because of the bear?
I don't think there's really any bears in this region. At least none of that comes up. Yeti could be a Yeti, but
And that is our next episode.
yeah. No, there's one of the theories is that it was a Yeti, so we'll get back to that. But something caused them to leave the tent. We're not sure why. And the next thing I want to talk about here is that the tent actually goes and gets inspected by a criminal expert, a woman by the name of G. Trakina. And so she identifies the tears in the tent on the opposite side of the entrance. They're not actually tears. They're cuts made by a knife. And so these cuts were actually made from the inside of the tent, suggesting that they were made as like an escape route. And whatever was going on, guy's outside, he's peeing, and for whatever reason, something happens that alarms the group, and they cut their way out of the other side of the tent, and they all run off into the snow.
I mean, that's a pretty big deal when you think about it. You don't want to ruin your tent. So to have to be so scared that they had to cut their way out of the backside of a tent, I mean, that's supplies that they're wasting right there by doing so.
Yeah, it's really weird. It's really weird. And it throws the whole thing off even further because they're like, oh, yeah, the wind blew them away, avalanche. But once they realize that the tent had like knife cuts in it and the knife cuts came from inside the tent, they're like, okay, we have no idea what's going on. Why would they cut their way out of this tent? So at this point, the search is suspended and it's planned to resume in April for the remaining bodies. Also, there's a strange thing that happens where the authorities, they want to bury this group in like a mass grave. And so they want to just like bury them in Ividal and have one obelisk and be done with it. And they go as far as to lie to the parents of the hikers. And they claim that the other parents in the group had agreed. But after they refused, the authorities, they like, okay, well, let's reach a compromise here. We'll bury them in Sverdlovsk. But that's only going to be, it can't be one big event. It's got to be broken up. And there's this weird like cover-up thing happening where the government doesn't want to make a big deal out of this. They're trying to like brush it under the rug for some reason. And everyone's like speculating as to why. And so, anyways, they end up having this decent-sized funeral. And around that time, people start coming forward talking about seeing these giant fireballs in the sky, these orbs in the sky over the mountains in early February. This comes up a bunch of times, including from a group of hikers nearby. So remember the 10 photos we talked about earlier? The 10 photos from the final day. The last one, we talked about having that light smudge on it, or like that weird glowing orb. Well, during the investigation, all of a sudden, all this information is coming out about these orbs in the sky in the mountains at this time. And so that last photo comes up, and because they're doing the investigation and they're developing this film, and the film shows up, and there's the last photo in the reel is a black photo with a light smudge and a fire orb in the middle of it.